Greetings, men of 222. It's great to be with you today. I'm closer to coming home. You're closer to staying there. And I understand we've had some great meetings. I understand last week, I want to thank Mike, Cassie, and Chad, and the guys that are leading these groups. But Duke, and it came about last week talking about Elite Force, that we probably need to do something relative to dad, letters from dad. And so I've asked Duke to begin to prepare something for that, and perhaps he and I together, or Duke alone, will be able to bring us that. But fatherhood is so important. That's really what we're talking about all the time. And we're in the topic of initiative right now. And today we're going to discuss the concept of teaching. And that sounds like such a simple concept, but to many of you, you'll begin to freak out, because when you think about teaching, you think about teaching a college class or a high school class, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about teaching your sons and daughters life, teaching them life as a father is supposed to do. Our biblical hero for this segment is Ezra, who gives us, without question in my mind, the best model for teaching in the entire Bible. And teaching is no more or less than simply explaining to someone how to do something. So don't make it harder than it is. Now, if you are teaching Bible, or if you're teaching in a high school, or there's a lot more study that's involved, but this is about teaching someone life, letting them know what it is. So don't make it harder than it is. Now, I'm not a very good carpenter, and I'm an even worse fisherman. And my boys would have been cheated in those endeavors if it hadn't been for my father-in-law, Dale Stump. What a man. WW2 guy, just an incredible man. And he spent hours with our boys teaching them how to fish and how to do carpentry work. And even though they were very, very young at the time, to this day, when they talk about fishing, it's what he taught them. And when they talk about carpentry, it's not only what he taught them, but he taught them the fact that they didn't have to be afraid of carpentry, that they could try things. And that's why they do the things that they do today and are very successful, far more so than their old man, that's for sure. Now, Ezra 7:10, that's where I want to go. Ezra 7:10 tells us, "For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, to practice it, and to teach his statutes and his ordinances in Israel." That tells you all you need to know about teaching right there. All good teaching follows this pattern. We study something, then we practice it, and then we teach others what we know. In the past, and even to a point today, doctors learned to teach by following another doctor around, as did attorneys, as did carpenters, and as did musicians, for example. This is the pattern for great teaching. What is that? To study what you need to know, to practice it, and then once you have it down or close to it, then you teach others. Notice the pattern follows another great passage of teaching in the Bible. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 7 says this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is our God. The Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words I'm commanding you today, and they shall be on your heart. You shall," he's talking to dads now, "you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and you shall talk of them when" what? "When you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up." So in other words, teaching is as natural as breathing. It's something that you do just every day. It's just part of living. It's part of life. So get off your cell phone and be with your children. Teach them. This may require a family rule, like no phones when we drive, which is a good one. No phones when we eat dinner, or we may have a phone-free hour or 5 hours. Many of you have heard me say in the past that some of the best teaching that I ever got accomplished, or at least learning, that's for doggone sure, was when I picked up the boys from college, or Stephen from the Cape. It's really hard to get out of the car at 65 miles an hour. It's amazing how much you can have an interchange. Sure, they go to sleep initially, but then they begin to talk to you about what happened that semester, what happened that summer, and it's just rich. It's just terrific stuff. Even if you take your child to practice, it's a great time to talk. When you take them to church, now sometimes on Sunday mornings that's hard because they may not be in such a wonderfully receptive mood, but it's part of life again. When you rise up, when you sit down, when you lie by the way, and when you walk, all those things, right? Here's the stark reality for you though. Either you teach your children or society will. It's just that simple. Either you teach them or society will. Do you want your children to learn about purity from their friends? Do you want society to teach your children about whether abortion is appropriate or not, or pornography? Because they think it's absolutely appropriate. One of the biggest problems that we face today is that society is teaching a counterfeit manhood. Counterfeit manhood. You see it all the time. You see that fear is being substituted for respect, selfishness for service, convenience for commitment, tolerance for truth. Parenting is hard work, and we must put in the work to get the desired results. If we don't, we end up with things like the mass shootings that we've seen because we have young men who are drifting without men in their lives. I'm just going to make an aside here. This is not in the script. We're having trouble finding coaches with the Crusaders. We're having trouble finding officials. Fewer and fewer people are volunteering. Christian fathers should be volunteering to coach their kids' teams all the time, to have an impact in their lives. You've got to spend time with them, and who better to be doing it, men, than you and me who have a biblical perspective. One of the problems we also have today is that we won't let our children fail. We've bought into the lie that if they fail, they'll be scarred for life. They may be challenged, but every one of us knows that some of the greatest lessons that we ever learned in the times of growth occurred when we failed, not when we succeeded, and had to deal with the consequences. We learned we didn't like the feeling of losing, and we had to try harder. We learned that we needed to put in more time to be able to work, to do algebra well. We learned all kinds of things, but we didn't learn them because we necessarily succeeded. It was when we failed that we learned the most, for most of us. My understanding, by the way, is that when a giraffe is born, one of the first things that the mother does after the giraffe gets to his feet, she knocks him over on purpose. So he has to struggle to get back up again. And then she knocks him over again and again so that he has to struggle. But the point is, that's how he learns to get up off the ground. Listen, do you ever think about this? Giraffes like really long legs, right? And think about how tough it is to get up off the ground, especially when you don't know what you're doing. What about birds? That's why birds at some point kick the other birds out of the nest, the little nestlings. Why? So they can't stay there forever, because that's not life. They've got to get out there and get in the world and learn how to fly, learn how to forage, learn how to fend for themselves, right? When we say we don't want our kids to have a victim mentality, most of us really agree with that. We really don't want our kids to have a victim mentality, and yet we never let them fail. We go in and we intercede for them. We try to make sure that life is comfortable, that they never have to deal with failure. One of the best decisions that Sherilyn and I ever made was to make Bo go to his second grade teacher to confront him over what he had said to Bo in class that day. It was very unfair. It was wrong. But instead of us going, we made Bo go back, second grade. Now, we didn't always do this well, but this particular time we did well. And he went back and he confronted that fella. And not only did that fella understand and listen and hear his position, but he apologized to Bo because he said, yes, you're right. What I did was wrong. Isn't that incredible? And Bo learned an invaluable lesson, and the invaluable lesson that he learned was that he can stand up for himself, that he doesn't need someone else to go in and fight his battles for him. If your child is faced with a dilemma and it's not immoral behavior by someone, now immoral behavior, that's a different thing. You need to intercede immediately. But if it's not immoral, we need to let them to learn to fight their own battles. What if they decide they will not confront that person? Well, that's a choice as well, and it teaches them something else. When you intercede for your child, as in complaining to a teacher about a grade or a coach about playing time, you teach your child a terrible, I had written bad, but it's worse than bad. It's a terrible lesson because you teach them that they are the center of the universe. Not only do you see them that way, but then they begin to see themselves as the center of the universe. And everything revolves around that, and you and them, and you want to make them really selfish. That's the best way to do it. And of course, that's a terrible thing. You also teach them, by the way, what you really think about God and God's sovereignty. Because if you won't let God be in control and you won't let God be in charge, why? Because you don't like the outcome and you're going to be God for him. That teaches them, well, Dad says that he believes that God is sovereign, but he doesn't really believe that because he's trying to do God's work for him. Think about that. For me, one of the most difficult verses in the Bible is Ephesians 6:4. It says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. Now, what makes that hard for me is because discipline in and of itself makes people frustrated, perturbed, right? Teaching and disciplining often occur together. And it's hard to make your kids, not make your kids mad at you when you discipline them. And yet, there seems to be, according to the Bible, a way that you can do that. Proverbs, I want to tell you this story. My Uncle Roger, who's 102 now, maybe 103, sent me an article one time about children, and their stock answer to being told no was to proclaim, you've ever heard this? You just don't understand. You just don't get it. You don't understand. And the writer suggested that our retort should be, yes, I do understand. The answer is no. You see, it's okay to say no to people. And yes, perhaps that exasperates a child, but listen to it this way. Think of it this way. That verse is really speaking to continuing to dig at them and make them angry. It's not discipline, especially when it's correct discipline biblically. It's annoying them just for the sake of annoying them, right? Now, Proverbs 15:2 gives us some great advice, hard but great, and it says this, the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable. Wow, so Ephesians 6:4 says give them instruction, discipline them, but 15:2 says the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, but the mouth of fools spouts folly. Now, John Wooden, who most of you remember, greatest American basketball coach ever, said it this way. A coach is someone who can give correction without causing resentment. When I read that probably 15 years ago, I really tried to change my coaching. It made it difficult in some ways because I wanted to be able to be forthright and accurate and bold, and yet I didn't want my players to resent the discipline and the instruction that I was giving them. It's a balance. It's something that you really have to work at. Now, let me make one last point, by the way. God calls us to teach in the church, by the way. In 1 Timothy 2:12 and 13, it says, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority of a man, but to remain quiet, for it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. You might ask yourself, why in the world are you putting this in here? Especially because my wife doesn't want to hear this. Well, maybe so, but here's the truth. The truth is that God has called men to, Ephesians 5, lead your family. God has called men, 1 Timothy 2:12 and 13, to teach in the church. If we abdicate our responsibilities, what God has asked us to do, women will fill the void. They will have to. But that won't be their fault. It will be our fault. We need to step up. Takeaways for this week. Being a role model is the most powerful form of educating. But too often fathers neglect it because they get so caught up in making a living they forget to make a life. John Wooden said that. The pattern for teaching is to study, to practice, and then to teach others. Teaching is not only a classroom concept, it is a teaching doing everyday mundane things like simply walking around, sitting, and talking together. Fourthly, let them fail. Allow them to grow by struggling. Men must be ready to teach in the church. Point 5. Must be ready. Hey, see you next Saturday, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise. Be intentional this week while you honor Jesus because he's alive.